In this series, we have explored what are often called the authentic letters of Paul, texts that are widely understood to reflect his own voice, written into real communities and real conflicts. Now we pause to gather the threads. In this final episode, we will summarize some of the most central insights that have emerged along the way, the tensions, the questions, and the patterns that shape Paul's thought.
As we now approach the end of this series, we need to ask a simple yet demanding question. What is it that we have actually done? The series has been titled Paul Under the Microscope. It is an ambitious title. It suggests that we would go into fine detail, analyze every word, every nuance, every historical layer, as if we could hold the texts still long enough to fully understand them. But the truth is different. We have not had the space to do that. And perhaps even more importantly, perhaps it cannot be done. What we have done is not a complete examination. It is a beginning, an opening, a willingness to read Paul with a more critical eye, and at the same time with a certain humility toward the complexity of what he writes. Because when we read the authentic letters together, a picture emerges that is not simple and cannot be reduced to a single line. Paul is not, first and foremost, a systematic theologian. He is a situational thinker. He writes into concrete conflicts, concrete communities, concrete relationships. He responds to problems. He tries to resolve tensions. He defends himself. He argues. He comforts. He exhorts. His theology is not written as a textbook. It is forged in struggle. And that means it carries the marks of that struggle. It is not always consistent. It is not always fully developed. It is not always harmonious. But precisely for that reason, it is alive. One recurring feature is the sense that something new has happened. Not just something important, but something decisive. An event that divides time into before and after. In his earliest letter, this is especially clear. The expectation of an imminent end is not just a theological idea. It shapes how people live, how they grieve, how they hope. Time is short. And yet, as we move through the later letters, that expectation does not disappear. It changes form. It becomes less explicit, but it remains present as an undercurrent. At the same time, Paul is deeply rooted in his Jewish background. He thinks within a monotheistic framework. He argues from the scriptures. He understands the world as created and governed by the God of Israel. He is not an outsider to this tradition. But then, something happens. In letters like Galatians and Romans, he opens the community to non-Jews without requiring observance of the law. This is not just a practical adjustment. It is a theological shift. If the law is no longer the entry point, then what defines the community? And at that point, the question becomes unavoidable. Who is Yeshua for Paul? The answer is not consistent. At times, Yeshua appears as a human being, a descendant of David, born of a woman, living within history. In Romans, he is described in exactly these terms, and it is the resurrection that elevates him. It is then that he is appointed to a new role. This is a low Christology, a view in which Yeshua is exalted by God. But then in other places, something more happens. In 1 Corinthians, Paul writes that there is one God, the Father, and one Lord, Yeshua the Messiah. This is not a casual statement. For a Jew shaped by strict monotheism, this is radical. He places Yeshua within the very structure of belief in one God. Not as a rival, but not merely as a prophet either, as something more. And then we come to the most striking passage of all. In Philippians, Paul quotes a hymn. Here Christ is described as being in the form of God, as one who empties himself and who is later exalted and given the name above every name. This does not only point forward, it points backward, toward pre-existence, toward a form of existence close to God before earthly life. Here we are very close to what can be called a high Christology. But Paul does not stop to explain it. He does not systematize it. He allows the tension to remain. And this is precisely what makes it so remarkable. It is as if he himself stands in the middle of a movement that has not yet been fully thought through. And it is here that we encounter a break that cannot be ignored. Because what Paul does with Yeshua does not fit easily within the traditional Jewish understanding of the Messiah. In Jewish thought, the Messiah is a human being, an anointed king, a descendant of David, one who restores justice and peace on earth. Not a heavenly figure, not one who shares God's status, not one who exists before his earthly life. So when Paul begins to use language that places Yeshua close to God, something new is happening. This does not necessarily mean that Paul abandons his Jewish faith, but it does mean that he reshapes it, he stretches it, he pushes it in a direction that was not predetermined. And when we see this as a whole, it becomes clear that Paul's letters take on a unique role in history. They become a bridge between a Jewish expectation of the Messiah and the later church theology in which Christ is understood as pre-existent and sharing in the being of God. In Paul's letters, we do not find the finished doctrine. We do not find the Trinity as it will later be defined. We do not find clear formulations, but we do find movement. We do find direction. In Philippians, pre-existence is suggested. In 1 Corinthians, monotheism is expanded. In 2 Corinthians, Christ is described as the image of God and the bearer of divine glory. This is no longer just a human messianic figure, but it is not yet the fully developed high Christology of later Christianity. So what we see is an intermediate position, a tension. Paul stands with one foot in Judaism and one foot in something that is becoming something else. And that is why his letters can be read in two directions: backward into Jewish tradition, forward into church theology. But this tension is not limited to Christology. It appears in other areas as well. In 2 Corinthians, Paul presents weakness as strength. He overturns conventional ideas of power and authority. He defends his apostleship not by pointing to success, but by pointing to suffering. In 1 Corinthians, he tries to hold together a divided community. He balances freedom and order, spirit and structure, ideal and reality. In Philippians, we encounter a more personal voice, one that expresses joy, but also vulnerability. And in Philemon, we face something very concrete. A relationship between a master and a slave. Paul challenges the relationship, but he does not abolish the system. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Where is the line between what is challenged and what is accepted? This leads us into the most difficult reflections. Paul's understanding of sin, especially in Romans, is universal. All human beings are under sin. For some, this makes sense, especially for those who carry a sense of guilt. But for those who have suffered injustice, this perspective can feel very different. It can feel like an additional burden, as if one is not only a victim, but also guilty. And this is not a small issue. It goes to the heart of how we read Paul today. In the end, we are left with questions that cannot be easily closed. Was Paul faithful to Yeshua, or did he develop something new? How much of his theology is shaped by the expectation of an imminent end? Where is the boundary between continuity with Judaism and theological rupture? Can his universal understanding of sin be defended in the face of human suffering? And what do we do with texts that do not clearly challenge unjust social structures? But perhaps the most important thing is not to answer all these questions. Perhaps the most important thing is to recognize that they exist. Because Paul does not give us a finished system. He gives us a landscape in motion. A theology in development, a voice that is both rooted and innovative, and perhaps that is why he is still read. Not because he gives us clear answers, but because he forces us to ask better questions. And perhaps that is where this series must be allowed to end, not with a conclusion, but with an opening, a willingness to continue, to read more deeply, more slowly, and to ask new questions, even where there are no simple answers. Because Paul under the microscope is not a conclusion, it is an invitation.
This series has taken us through the authentic letters of Paul, not to close the discussion, but to open it. What we have seen is not a finished system, but a mind at work, a voice in tension, a theology in motion. And perhaps that is where its value lies. In the next series, we will turn to the other letters attributed to Paul and ask what happens when this movement continues and begins to take new forms. Thank you for listening.